Imagine for a moment the archetypal fantasy world, with magic and elves and far-off lands and adventures. Zero in for a bit on the setting. What do the cities look like? Is there an organized religion? How much of it is magical and how much mundane? Broaden out a bit. Think about the world as a whole. Does it have a tropics? That wasn't your default setting, was it? Does it have a Far East? Do you imagine a world that parallels our own in some ways? It isn't real, but it is familiar, and we have shared elements in our collective imagination. We also have a shared language. Elves and orcs are something we generally understand to have common traits, even if they're made up for completely different worlds. When you imagine that world, how much history do you put into it? I don't just mean lore, I mean the flow of history, the change of cultures with time, the advance of technology, the redrawing of maps. By its nature as a historical strategy game, Anbennar, a mod for Europa Universalis 4 and now its companion in Anbennar for Victoria 3, presents a fantasy world built to center history. You may already be familiar with it. Indeed, you may already be familiar with it even if you've never heard of it. In looking at Anbennar, a collective project with a fairly open development and accompanying dissertation, there are some unambiguous goals and sources of inspiration for the mod. More than just guess at development intents, we can know the visions. Plural. Much of this was written prior to reading the dissertation or looking at the developer discussions, and thus based on my experience with the mod. I wanted to take a similar approach to the Bannerlord world-building videos where, of course, I had played the game a lot before I ever combed the dev diaries for developer intent. I cannot be as thorough as I was for Bannerlord, given that instead of 6 cultures with distinct content and a uniform team, we're looking at a game with probably around 100 fleshed out factions and nearly as many contributors, surely. That shift ultimately suits my approach, as this is a near inversion of the Bannerlord situation. Rather than looking at a fictional world and trying to pick at its clear historical anchor points and inspiration, I want to look at a full-on fantasy world and discuss the broad ideas of how it comes from our own in often indirect ways. I want to explore how to thread the needle and build a new yet familiar world. There are a lot of familiar things within Anbennar on both the historical and the fantasy side. Historical parallels abound, with conditions. At first blush, the temptation may be to see in most tags some clear and heavy historical parallel, which gives way to seeing some tags as predominantly history-inspired and some as fantasy-inspired. That's the more apt description, I'd say. Historical parallels are not strict in a one-to-one way. Rather, there's a drawing from the toolbox, the world-building kit of history. I've said as much before in the Elder Scrolls world-building video, about Anbennar no less. The best TLDR I can give for this section is that in historical strategy discussion, it's good to clarify if you're talking about a country as a historical presence or a play archetype. Maybe it's tedious and pedantic of me, but I do find the semi-regular discussions of who is who a little tiring. That's not to say there's no merit to the discussions, but there's some snags that can occur. Contrast these two posts that happened in the time of me writing this video and you'll see what I mean. Part of the problem is that people are somewhat speaking past each other. When someone asks who the Portugal of this game is, they're asking after, more often than not, a play archetype. But that doesn't stop people from calling Gawed both Britain because of industrialization and Russia because of North Cold Big. Who is Russia in Anbennar doesn't have a neat answer, but what would the answer need to be? Are we talking mechanically or stylistically? Does it have to have a capital in the eastern portion of a fantasy Europe equivalent and expand further east? Does it style itself as a successor state to some ancient empire, like a third Rome? Does it have to eat this game's equivalent of a Poland? We can't even settle who Poland is to begin with. Anbennar itself, the titular empire, is not just the HRE, nor is it Germany-like, is it? There's not a lot that says Germany to me if you actually look at what it is, and indeed, what it becomes. In some sense, these questions can be partially answered by their historical eventualities. Rather than asking, who is Portugal, based on mechanical things like colonial tendencies and national ideas, we can ask based on who, in the Victoria 3 era, ends up as a small Canorian presence with a globe-spanning set of outposts and colonial holdings. But that's almost the same archetype as the Netherlands, isn't it? In either case, it would sort of be Bucelar. But such a test is far from sufficient. The small country, often called a Netherlands equivalent in EU4 Anbennar, does not go on to have a colonial presence at all. This exemplifies how pressing that kind of test onto the game would never work. Remember, toolbox approach. History is an inspiration, and in only the loosest sense of historical movement, a guide. Anbennar asks the question of a fantasy setting: what if there was a fantasy world but with a Renaissance, age of exploration, intercontinental empires and colonization, and eventually revolutions and industrialization? Rather than the typical stagnant medieval setting, Anbennar keeps to EU4's historical progression. I don't think this was just a byproduct of wanting a fantasy game in the EU4 game engine. It's an intentional narrative structure. And it provides us that ounce of familiarity that makes it easier to grasp the world we're staring at. Even, and dare I say especially, as the world goes outside what is familiar fantasy. That's not to say there aren't some pretty heavily implied comparisons. Isobelin is pretty one-to-one with New York City, but it's also unique for that, and in order to draw the comparison it does, it transcends the 1444 to 1821 timeline of events pretty aggressively. It uses the narrative of mid-1800s New York City as a basis. Speaking of narrative is crucial for the characterization of a world we would otherwise be unfamiliar with. The world building of Anbennar relies on a heavy use of missions for narrative where EU4 doesn't need that, per se. Yes, EU4 does explore historical events and include flavor for significant situations, but events that look like this are rare in EU4, largely contained to telling the player about a historical figure like Leibniz or from the Women in History DLC. But let's step back a moment. While there are both elements of fantasy inspiration and historical inspiration in some tags, in others the split is hard. You tell me with a straight face who any of the serpent spine represent in our real-world history. Go on, do it. Historical comparison is partly reserved for humanity with a dash of the elves. Oh, and the orcs, but that one's complicated. I won't call this a weakness of world building, but it's noteworthy and has some consequences. There's the culture groups question. Most races are just one group. It's largely a balanced thing, I imagine, but most of the fantasy races have racial culture groupings. This might be for a mechanical limitation, in truth. The two races that transcend race-based culture groupings are humans and the Ruinborn. The Ruinborn have this multiple culture group setup, probably because if they didn't, they'd be a culture union of like half the world. I'm not going to say that this flattens certain races in favor of others, because clearly the different dwarven holds have heaps of narrative and lore to their names. It does, however, have an impact, and in some ways further heightens the role of narrative in the mod. Heavy narrative reliance has a downside, however, which I can only imagine the developers are aware of given the dissertation. The use and creation of mission tree heavy tags means that while of course not each MT is canon, just like vanilla, you can't really make your own story in the same way. In the past, I've talked about Civ 7's potential issue of shared experience and communicability issues. In short, the nature of how open-ended one's build is in that game with a trajectory through multiple civs as any given leader makes it harder to shorthand the experience as, say, playing Germany and getting a great Hansa setup. One has to clarify a lot more significant details. In some ways, Anbennar has, with its mission trees, found the opposite issue. Emergent play feels like a background note to the stories that unfold. The drama of a run is the plot you uncover, far more than the player choices, AI actions, and player reactions. Vanilla EU4 is not 100% emergent, of course. There are scripted events to be anticipated. The Burgundian inheritance is a mechanic rather than an occasional systemic outcome as other personal unions would be. This is a part of the design that will always have its ups and downs. Historical knowledge helps the player in some sense. With the upcoming EU5, prepping for the plague is probably going to be helpful, if you follow. Anbennar has more than just historical knowledge to draw from. Rather than use shorthands of just historical knowledge, there are tropes of fantasy that are also invoked, be they for their familiarity alone or for their subversion, which, of course, the more that happens, the more it becomes, itself, a trope. We who know fantasy can defaultly intuit why orcs and goblins are organized in a tribal fashion at game start. We know that city goblins would be an exception. D&D, somewhat famously, has entered a post-monster era to the chagrin of some players. Killing orcs and goblins has taken on a moral dimension to others because it's innately a bit awkward to cast something as both sentient and as killable as a wild animal. In turn, the savage orc trope is an item to lean into just as much as the "we are not monsters" orc trope. Anbennar, cleverly, lets this be mechanically explored. Speaking of, let's touch on mechanics for a moment. Anbennar is shaped by history and fantasy, that much is clear. But it's also apparent to me that EU4's shape itself not only bounds and confines what Anbennar can do, but indeed informs the shape of Anbennar at its conceptual levels. When considering where EU4 derives its mechanics from, it's clearly an effort to simulate history, but it is built from little more than previous iterations. The developers try to devise a system to represent, say, the Curia, and then, to not leave Protestantism simply without its own mechanic, given it can't use the same one, they devise church power. And then the Orthodox nation should probably get something bespoke as well, and so on and so on. Some might call this feature creep, but I think that's dependent on the impact it has on the game. Anbennar, by design, works with the mechanics EU4 hands it and is capable of holding. And they push the boundaries. What started as a desire to use the HRE mechanic in a second location with the Raj ended up hitting the hard barrier of EU4 not allowing 2 HREs, and thus the birth of an entirely new system for organizing the Raj. In turn, the third thing shaping Anbennar arises. Beyond history and fantasy, we have EU4 itself, and the recursive way by which Anbennar's lore is in part shaped by EU4's capabilities. So it is that certain mechanics, like the mission system, are leaned into harder than ever, to tell stories, to provide us with the history and the details that we would otherwise never know because the world of Anbennar does not exist very far outside of Anbennar. If you want to know more about Spain, there's thousands of books about Spanish history and culture. But if you want to know more about Eordand, the only place to go is into the narrative that emerges from playing it, and some adjacent tags. The Anbennar world being built around EU4 is distinct from having it built around history. In actual history, 1444 is not a particularly significant year. Yes, significant events happened, but the nearby 1453 is a fair bit more famous. EU3 used 1453 for the end of the 100 Years' War and the fall of Constantinople. EU5 uses 1337 for the start of the 100 Years' War. Anbennar uses 1444 because of EU4, and mechanically it can't really go backward from there, because it would mean having to invent whatever mechanics would be necessary of the Green Tide, which may not even be possible in EU4. I don't know if EU4 has in it whatever would be necessary to reliably create a scan at the start date with its uncolonized provinces and heap of adventurers. Far more than because history had the emergence of the printing press, Anbennar has the emergence of the printing press because it is already a mechanic in EU4. Far more than being a lazy choice, it's another way of keeping it tethered to the familiar, this time on the side of play more than on the side of historical shorthand. I've already mentioned in a past video how the printing press is a bit weird as an institution, chartered as it is more to the cementing of Protestant realms than it is to the actual inventing of the press. So while it's a bit odd for it to be central in another completely different world with magic where a press might be too mundane, it was already an odd choice for EU4 in some sense. Moving on. The setting is unambiguously informed by the Ages system. Where institutions are grounded squarely in history, the Ages are changed. They lean far more into fantasy. Yes, the first age is functionally one with exploration in it and gameplay-wise echoes the vanilla first age, but the narrative as taken from the title as the Age of Monsters with its Greentide art is clearly centering something other than exploration. In some sense, the ages are different genres. Age of Monsters with the Greentide is like traditional fantasy where the plot is orcs. Witch Kings is a darker fantasy. In the dissertation, this is framed with the former being high fantasy, easy to grasp good versus evil, where the latter is low fantasy and explores the repercussions of magic and its abuse and the violent reaction to said magic. I would make the case that the opposite has borne out over time. There are direct mechanics for dealing with Witch Kings that evoke the concept of evil, and in the lore, Witch Kings have been the closest to a unifying, all-or-nothing, everyone band together crusade-type scenario. The Green Tide, on the other hand, has a lot of low fantasy repercussions, enabled in part by Anbennar's growing focus on race and culture. If anything, the question of orcs and their presence and the development of slavery are very, very concerned with repercussions. The dissertation says that Anbennar goes from high fantasy to low fantasy, but I think that's changed with time. Rather, the narrative differs between nation-states that can selectively embrace or ignore the low fantasy repercussions of the Greentide era. But those repercussions are always there. To go a step further, while of course not a one-to-one parallel, having the orcish transoceanic slave trade in the game does instantly call up those questions of complexity and morality and consequences that old-school fantasy, back when orcs were just enemies, would ignore. Further, in acknowledging the slave trade and making it a button to embrace it, Anbennar ostensibly interacts more with slavery than EU4 felt comfortable doing. I don't think the complexification of these early setting details, the shift away from the start high fantasy and go low, is a loss for the vision. Indeed, I find the uncomfortable questions around orc slavery that the game puts forward to be compelling, a good part of the writing. Demonsterization is a good mechanic to include for bridging the perspectives of old fantasy tropes and the new. The broader point, however, remains. EU4's mechanics shaped the setting. Having brought up the dissertation again, it's time to address it more directly. In responding in part to the accompanying dissertation in a fashion I might with a dev diary, I do not mean to imply that this is all the work of one mind. Having looked through the Discord and seeing the collaborative efforts and how many voices contribute to the story of Anbennar, that would be absurd to claim. The dissertation discusses the history of world-building, concepts of player agency, story, and play linearity, and so on. The project of Anbennar was made with an awareness of those things I often discuss when looking at games as well. If you read it, you'll see a lot of shared points, both with this video and with my other discussions of world building. Point being, there's an agreement on the value of considering the world one builds rather than just slapping together some cool what-ifs and calling it a day. However, I will note that it has been years since the dissertation, and that while a vision is laid out in it, there have been selective movements away from it. For example, I do think that the idea of a moral grayness does exist in the mod more than the typical fantasy setting still, but many tags are agreed upon to be unambiguously evil. Is this a failure of vision? A loss of cohesion? No. The self-serving actions of nation-states take up the core of narrative action and often cannot be viewed in a moral lens. While there may be some solidly evil entities, there are few solidly good ones. This isn't grimdark edge, it's the grayness of nation-state zero-sum politics. And a self-interested state would, in fact, fight against the necromancer magelord trying to take over the world, of course. The call to arms does not need to be divine when it can be pragmatic. Rather than good and evil, I'd suggest that we can understand the states of Anbennar as we do states in history. Rather than good and evil, we can understand them by their ethos and objectives, something akin to their civilizing missions. Every state rationalizes its own existence in some way or another, and in the setting of Anbennar, that is no different. This is informed by the limits of EU4 in a way, or more accurately, by its tendencies. There is no such thing as a rising tide that lifts all boats. In EU4, going a century without being in a single war does not actually leave you better off. War is not a strain on prosperity to a degree where avoiding it entirely is helpful to a player. Instead, the strategy is don't lose wars, and expanding through conquest, even of a geographically or culturally bounded territory, is almost always preferred over some kind of hyper-tall pacifist play. If you want a deeper look into the moral questions of EU4 play and how Anbennar has looked at them, there's actually a country that's more or less about that, the Sword Covenant into Covenblad. I don't have time for a full digression on that, but the point is that this has been considered. D&D ethics can't exist in a D&D inspired setting that uses EU4's state-centric play as a base because the state does not concern itself solely with the vanquishing of evil. To wrap back to the dissertation, the fact that so much of my thinking prior to reading it and after reading it remained the same is, in some sense, a testament to the ultimate clarity of vision and presentation that Anbennar has. It's hard to sift out things that are a considerable design ethos departure from the base EU4 experience, beyond the obvious focus on mission trees and their role as vehicles of information and immersion. A lesser one noted in the dissertation is the deployment of disasters. In EU4, these are not terribly common to gameplay. Some nations have inbuilt ones that they'll experience, some being entirely unavoidable. But I do not think they'd be considered a core part of gameplay. When I discussed player autocracy and the general issue of modeling the internal politics of a nation, and EU4's lower emphasis on this, that would have been a decent time to bring up disasters as a means of fleshing out that internal politics. However, it wasn't until playing Anbennar that said use came into focus. For EU4, while I would say that bespoke disasters better represent internal situations than rebel stacks, the generic disasters do very little for it, and so few tags have unique ones that there's not a lot of interior on display. In Anbennar, the Dwarves of the Serpent Spine are shaped by multiple disasters that go into detail about the society they're impacting. The dissertation makes it clear this use is intentional. All of this is intentional. The conclusion of the dissertation includes the line, "World building inside a box, inside the EU4 framework, is more of a boon than a curse, providing a much-needed structure to guide and motivate the process of world building." But it's time to move past the initial vision presented by the dissertation and into the future, relatively speaking. As someone who has the joke life goal of managing to buy out the Arcanum of Steamworks and Magica Obscura IP from whoever owns it and turn it into some kind of 4X game, Vic3 Anbennar is about as close as will realistically exist. There's something to the way subverting history is an incentive in these games. With Anbennar, a world with a harder to intuit canon, it's less present as a motive. Or perhaps I should say, was. While there have been notes one could find, wikis to read, and so on for quite a while, that's a fair bit less accessible and, more importantly, a lot more tangible than something like the starting point of Victoria 3's Anbennar. If you asked me to write up who I thought was going to be in positions of power based on my experiences with the EU4 Mod, or lore I'd read in mission trees and national ideas, I don't think I'd have come up with what Vic Bennar looks like. That's not a knock on the vision so much as just a consequence of having mission trees all written from an angle of relative plausibility. What Elantir adventure settler states survive into 1820? I don't know. Maybe I'd guessed Amiens and Eordain resist colonization. Honestly, given how deep the Kobold tree is for the Dragon Coast and how much I enjoyed Riveria, I'd probably have put one of those two ahead of the Gnomish hierarchy, but they're a big force in Vic Bennar. I don't think I'd have even assumed colonization of Helleste by Canorians happened. I'm not upset with the canon, sad that some Blorbo country is gone, but I do think it highlights the way real-world understandings of history shape our presumptions of what Victoria 3 Vanilla's map looks like. Even if you know next to nothing about the 1800s, you do, presumably, know that Brazil exists, that India was a British colony, that westernization itself was a thing in the first place. In a fascinating twist, where the original Anbennar draws its inspiration from history and fantasy filtered through the shape and potentials of EU4, Victoria Anbennar cannot repeat this process. In turn, it gets to have an angle, a dynamic between it and EU4 Anbennar that their vanilla counterparts do not. In a narrative sense, Vic Bennar is a sequel to EU4 Bennar because it is the main site of the story's continuation. It is a sequel of a deeply open-ended story that, in theory, has a historical canon, but in practice, never plays out the same way twice. The world has to make sense from an in-universe historical perspective more than it has to include Victoria 3 parallels. I like South American gameplay, but there isn't really anything strictly comparable here, a thunderdome of independent settler states all fractured from one empire with a unifying formable and almost no contemporary colonial intervention. To reuse an old point, Bucelar in Vic 3 ends up a core colonial power, not at the top, but clearly established. They're like a unified Netherlands with colonies in terms of power at the start, but they aren't archetypally Vic 3 Netherlands gameplay. Speaking of colonial powers, the core colonial powers are Laurent, Anbennar itself, the Gnomish hierarchy, Bucelar, and the Northern League. These options feel less like they provide Victoria archetypes than they simply feel like continuations of the history set out by Anbennar. That said, the world's colonial expansion is very Euro-Canor-centered. Drawing the line between real-world and fantasy-world inevitabilities is difficult. But all this talk about inevitability is not to say that the world feels penned in now. Nothing in EU4 Anbennar has changed to force Vic 3's starting point to happen. Much like EU4 Anbennar was built with an interesting range of starting nations, Vic 3 Anbennar was as well. And much like vanilla Victoria 3's material reality of provinces and resources, some nations have an intrinsic disadvantage and others an advantage in ways one could not predict from EU4 Anbennar. I do feel less grounded, ironically, when it comes to the real-world politics side of play. I don't have a strong sense for who it feels correct to say become a democracy, who it's subversive to have become a vanguard state. Now, this isn't a concern that I think EU4 Anbennar faces because the flavor and motives of play, of roleplay, are concentrated elsewhere. But Victoria, in its emphasis on internal politics, thrives by writing or countering the currents of history in terms of politics. EU4's subversion is often things like, what if Brittany became a global empire? Victoria can still have that kind of narrative, of course, but turning Japan into a council republic is a different kind of motivator, and it relies on attachment to familiar history. You can see this in the way that one of the more amusing parts of Victoria is seeing what flags and name changes occur under what conditions. That's something I personally chase when playing. It's why becoming Burgundy is a fun goal, even if it doesn't have any mechanical value and is, in fact, suboptimal play. As this world fleshes out and expands, and I become familiar with its characters, I'm certain that groundedness will change. I think having more texture to the world in ways that genuinely are a bit more parallel might actually help this. More than just leaders, I want to know who the social theorists of this world are, the canon inventors. Who was the person that articulated class struggle? Who was the person that revolutionized medicine? Ultimately, the point here, though, is that Victoria 3 Anbennar has created a new avenue for fleshing out the world, with bespoke mechanics, mixing with what are now layers of familiarity. These mods do something unexpected to their respective base games. They present us with the perspectives these games seek to create without the same context. In some sense, they've created an immersive historical mindset by virtue of being fantasy. Let's take the example of the ruin-born states in the south with Teichand, Devand, and Keonai. Now, I know from the lore, the general vibe of these places is kind of like Greek Aegean city-states, and there's a dragon that matters later and a pinch of Essos flair all around a world of ruins. But when you play as, say, a Kenorian power, and all you really get is claims on the region, the incentive to conquer it from afar, you don't interact with that flavor. This is, I would say, an unintended strength. If I play in the region, I pay attention to provinces, learn their names, their goods, think about how I would build a nation there, and develop some manner of attachment to the lore and layout. When the place is a potential colony to me and little more, I forego bothering to learn even province names. Because it will be handed off to a subject nation, there's a detachment from the place. This is core EU4, but EU4 can't have the same effect in the same way. I'm certain there's people out there for whom the New World provinces become a blur, for whom despite conquering them 100 times, they could hardly be named and don't feel like real places. But chances are that you know the lore without reading a single text box in-game because you studied even a base level of history. I just doubt that any Spain player has never heard of the Aztecs before. Your prior knowledge fleshes out the area that you intend to conquer. In Anbennar, that's not necessarily the case. In theory, this isn't something the mod changes, but in being a fantasy world, the limit of prior exposure makes it possible. I am given a more colonialist experience in my ignorance. I've wiped tags from the map in Anbennar only to later realize they had a unique religion and go, wonder what that's about, and play them later. There's no need to give us the lore of conquered people when we can learn it in our own time, by being them. It's quite possibly the most imperial that the game has managed to make me feel. I could take all the southern continent and probably be able to name like 3 provinces after when my only interaction was colonial, when I had no need or impulse to get familiar. At most, I'd take a look at trade goods and move on, or pick war targets based solely on dev cost and so on. There's a twinge of irony to that fact of heightened unfamiliarity, given that technically Anbennar's new world is its old world, and that the Ruinborn are magically mutated elves. If anything, the people of Anbennar are more poised to understand the colonized Western Hemisphere than Europeans were in our own history. There's even some shared language traits between the Kenorians and Ruinborn. The river Ain has the same root word as the Elvish word for river, Ain. Imagining first contact between Europeans and Native Americans is already difficult in its own ways, imagining the barriers of language and culture. But with Anbennar, the struggle of imagination is wondering just how much felt familiar to the elves. None are alive who fled Elantyr, but if language has some root, and there are decipherable murals and marks of the old culture, the ruin, then it's just such a different narrative and equally fascinating. To tie that back to an earlier point around the idea of canon paths, there's something significant to the way one cannot presume who among the non-West of this world makes it. If you didn't see the map for Victoria 3 Anbennar, would you assume Rahen, the India parallel, all becomes a Kenorian colony? Would you assume there's some kind of Meiji Japan parallel elsewhere that canorizes to defy colonization? And are the Ruinborn all denied a nation-state? Indeed, it forces a compelling question. Is our perception of historical people in their own time impacted by how we know their story ends? Is the fact that a nation of people are denied a nation-state in the present with respect to sovereign boundaries something that we reflect into the past? These games are, of course, about the derailment of history just as much as they are about history itself. The premise is practically subversion more than historicity. The appeal is, in some sense, what if the Aztecs won? The appeal is the potential of alt history. It's barely more than idle musing, but I can't help wondering how much the presence of an identifiable nation-state in the present affects the perception of a people in depictions of the past. It's for this reason that people often talk about Native American nations in a sort of limbo state, flipping between present and past tense. The state is gone, but the nation persists, but I don't think we do a great job of teaching people that distinction. Putting the sovereignty of said nations into game terms, they, historically, lost the game. But we cannot know from the 1444 Anbennar map alone who even loses. There are mission trees with fantastic depth that are not canon in their future happenings so much as canon in their potentiality. How far does the historical Ryaz get? Is the lizardfolk state of Anbennar partway through the tree, so to speak? Did they discover this or that mutation? Have they worked out the spires? Anbennar invites more of these questions as much as it settles others. Here's another framing. Canonically, Wex is not Austria. They start as the emperor, so they may give that impression, but they actually lose the emperorship canonically and are reduced to what we'd politely call a European microstate destined to be a hub for white-collar crime. Does it play out that way in-game? Often? Is it part of their tree? The tree doesn't play their canon, it plays their potential. Would players know this just from play? So unto the Ruinborn. Would the player be able to guess at their trajectory through play? Is it apparent? And with them comes an undoing of parallels more than any other, alongside a reframing of mechanics that feels almost more historically immersive. In being provided a fantasy world to contrast against, the historical strategy games gain another avenue of inspection. Ultimately, Anbennar is as much fantasy as it is history. In both cases, it draws from the familiar. That's not to say Anbennar is just ripping concepts from history and fantasy and mashing them together. There's tons of distinct things in the world, unique ideas, clever ones. I'm sure for almost every one of the things in there you could find something that looks similar-ish, but that's just the pit of fantasy. Is there anything exactly like the story of the Sun Elves? Maybe, but not so much that every player can go, oh, so that's just the plot of my favorite fantasy series of orcs and cities. The familiar, unfamiliar, historical, and fantastical. They all sit together in this collaborative work that is the product of its own developers as much as EU4's developers. And one thing Anbennar does, by virtue of being a mod, is make community collaboration a sort of constant affair. Sure, Paradox games are sometimes influenced by the occasional detailed forum post that advocates for a change in historical presentation, here and there, but that's different from the stories that naturally transmit from players to developers in a pure fictional space. We're playing pretend together, and in part due to the gradual development without expectations for particular quarterly releases, things are different. Paradox is already anomalous for the way it engages its own community. Genuinely. I don't think I've seen many studios have this kind of relationship with the players. Anbennar takes up that mantle and has an easier time with it, knowing, as they do, that they're also players. The barrier between play and development is as thin as willingness to contribute. I think, partly down to the fact it has a foundational document of sorts with a dissertation, both Anbennars manage to be cohesive. I think there's also a balance of knowing when to play into game systems and when to invent new ones. The new frontier of Vic 3 means the world of Anbennar has a canon history beyond wiki entries and little lore snippets. It has a reshaped world to become, or subvert. It has a new way in which it can become familiar. Hi. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I did the mod justice. I even contributed a tiny bit to Anbennar by fixing something that made it literally unplayable, if you catch my meaning. I've had fun with mostly playing Elantir tags because you really get to shape them, I feel. The next videos are probably also Paradox related unless something weird happens. Apologies if some of this one is a little scruffy. I've been switching over laptops and dealing with some things, and trying to keep it organized mid-video production was a challenge. Thanks to everyone who subscribes as I slowly claw my way to 100k, after which surely everything will be so very different. And thanks to the patrons who make this all the more feasible. This time we have Alessandro Andreoni, Gian Ursa, Cesare Mikua, Clever Riley 9, Dan C, Galactic Beyond, Gilded Dragon, Hornlet, Isaac of Lyria, Jay Kasky, Laird Olive, Le Sing Affame, Mark Soto, Mehrab, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitopir, Nelf Snuggler, Riley Long, Sipaternipsy, Third Xeno, Vichire, and Yura Silkorsky. Next time, more map game. Bye.